My next choice is 3 O'Clock High from 1987, and that is all about time and the ticking clock. That's basically the star of the film. 3 O'Clock High is, again, a bit of a Western. It's a bit High Noon with Gary Cooper. It's about a young boy at high school in America. You hear that, 1987, high school America. You're thinking John Hughes movies. It's nothing like that. It's much wittier. It's much smarter. It's much funnier, I think, with a great sense of black comedy. It's got more of Martin Scorsese's After Hours to it than it does the Breakfast Club, for example. But 3 O'Clock High itself, the young guy is a popular guy on campus, but not the most popular, just kind of middle of the road, Jerry. And he gets assigned to write about this new kid at school who's the ultimate school bully, who puts teachers into hospital and whatnot. And he gets on the bully's bad side straight away. And the bully says, "You and me, 3 o'clock, it's going down, I'm going to kill you. We're meeting outside in the parking lot and we're going to fight." And the film is a race against time for Jerry to somehow get out of this fight because he knows he will be killed if he has to square up to this guy. So Jerry tries everything, tries to get himself detention, tries to get himself suspended from school, tries to frame this other kid for possession of a knife and whatnot to get him thrown out, all sorts of shenanigans. But every few minutes and after every scene, really, we cut to the clock in some way. We see his watch or we see the clock on the wall and we see tick, 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 just going by, just to remind us he's 1 second closer to, the shootout, the gunfight, the OK Corral, if you want to insert here. And like Gary Cooper in High Noon, he's looking for help everywhere. Just none is coming. There's nothing he can do to avoid this gunfight. It seems inevitable. It was directed by Phil Janow, who should have gone on to a better career. He was a Steven Spielberg protege. I think he directed the Rattle and Hum U2 documentary and whatnot.
He did.
Should have done a lot more. Did some just dull 90s stuff. It's got a brilliant, funny script. It's shot by Barry Sonnenfeld, who would go on to be a big director in his own right, Get Shorty and things. But the Tangerine Dream score here, a bit like you were saying there, it's not one you would listen to on its own, like Thief and like your next pick, where this is more, it has to be listened to just in the context of the film. They only do about 3/4 of the soundtrack. The rest is done by Sylvester LeVay. But what they do is all the stuff that sets the tension and sets the heightened atmosphere for Jerry of every second getting closer to 3 o'clock. And every time he thinks he's caught a break and he's got a good idea to get out of it, no, not so much. So the guitars get a little bit heavier and crunchier as it gets down towards 3 o'clock. After High Noon, they start to bring in kind of Western guitars, like a Ry Cooder soundtrack or something. There's maybe someone we should cover as well. But they start to bring in that more Western feel, which in the morning, where he's having a good day, it's much more of a peppy pop soundtrack. And that's where more of the Sylvester LeVay tracks are. But then when the tension and the darkness and the bleakness needs to come in, it switches to Tangerine Dream. So it's an interesting use of saying two distinct entities are doing the soundtrack, but they're good at different things. So let's have them do those different things because the film's doing two different things. So it's a case of this soundtrack not working on its own. I listened to it last night just to double check because it's been a few weeks to pull the curtain back a bit since we were supposed to record this before I fell ill. Recovered now, thank you everybody. Thanks for your wishes. But I went back to revisit it just in case. Maybe it was my memory playing tricks that it doesn't quite work as an album, and it doesn't really. There's no beach scene from Thief, for example, where you'd think that would go on the playlist any day of the week. That's phenomenal stuff. There's not one track here where you think this is on its own great music, but everything is pertinent to what you're seeing on screen, to Jerry's story, his quest to avoid 3 o'clock. or to the bully himself, where the bully appears on screen, Tangerine Dream, that's where they bring in the deeper synths. And that's when the guitars start getting really out of control. Again, as you say, a little bit even metallic in places. They start to add that in when the bully gets more aggressive and whatnot. So this is another case of they're clearly writing for the script. They're not just composing music and saying, here you go. This is something where they clearly know the kind of movie that they're scoring, and it gives it a completely different feel to John Hughes films, which all just used soundtrack, songs. They didn't use scores by and large. They tended to just use, with a few exceptions, the main themes and whatnot. They tended to just use pop songs of the day. Some wonderful soundtracks from John Hughes movies, 16 Candles and Breakfast Club and whatnot. But Tangerine Dream, obviously, very different. You wouldn't have Tangerine Dream scoring The Breakfast Club, but they're a rather different film. But the tension that they set here is remarkable. But it's also quirky and offbeat because it's set against a high school in America. So it's not the kind of thing, it's not like Thief, it doesn't have those stakes. But for Jerry, it does because he thinks he's going to die at 3 o'clock. It's just a remarkable little film, very underrated, highly underrated. I think it's one of the real fun teen movies of the 80s that's kind of been lost to time a lot. And their soundtrack just accentuates it, contrasts in a few places where it kind of is a bit more playful. But at its peak, it treats it like the more serious alternate version of the film that is a showdown at high noon, which is just remarkably clever and deft of them to do that. I don't know if you've seen it or not, Peter, but
I have. It didn't even get a cinema release in Australia. It went straight to video, and the movie did flop. My recollection, I've only seen it once, was I think that the lead actor was miscast because he looked decidedly a lot older than being a teenager. I think he looked like he was 32.
No,
Was that be fair?
Fine. No, he's fine. He looks 15, 16, even though he was 21 or something. It's the bully, who in real life was 32 years old. But that's American high school movies for you, I suppose, isn't it?
Absolutely. They got away with it, like Matthew Broderick, he was much older. John Cusack, up to 32, was playing, I think, Say Anything, which was his finale as a teenager, and when he said enough, and that was really pushing the boundaries. But that was my recollection. But I do remember there was a lot of time. Time was the big feature, and there was a lot of urgency on it. And it doesn't have to be a ticking time bomb or a robbery, or sometimes personal affairs can be the biggest affairs. And in this person's life, having a blue with someone at 3 o'clock is the most important thing that he has to resolve. So that's the ticking time bomb of this movie. And, when you think about it, probably Tangerine Dream makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Which on paper, it just doesn't, but in practice, it absolutely does.
Yeah. Phil Janot, why do you think his career, do you think Rattle and Hum might have damaged it? Because he did do another movie that I have a lot of admiration for called State of Grace. Do you remember that with Gary Oldman?
Yeah, with Gary Oldman and Tim Roth, which I think is a really good little film. But, he would go on to just nonsense. I mean, I think he ended up, did he not just end up doing like TV movies and shorts, comic book things and whatnot? I think he did a lot of music videos. I think he worked with U2 quite a lot. We talked about him when I was on Ryan's channel doing the U2 series. I talked to him quite a bit there. And they did a lot of their most famous videos from the kind of Europa era, their German period. But State of Grace actually was a good shout. But again, that wasn't a hit. I think it's one of those unfortunate cases of he made 2 really good films. 3 if you include Rattle and Hum, because I like it. But none of them really broke through. So in Hollywood, it doesn't matter if they're good or not. They just didn't make money. So
if you don't make money, that's it. And the old Steven Spielberg protege can be like a leg iron around your ankle sort of thing.
And he took his name off the film, Steven Spielberg. He took his, which, who knows, but in the 80s, Steven Spielberg Presents was a pretty good endorsement. But when he took that off, maybe that was the death knell, who knows?
Absolutely. But yeah, look, nice job. And yeah, as I said, my memory, I'll track that movie down again and watch it. But my memory was that there was definitely a time signature, a very sort of urgent time signature all the way through that movie. And yeah, it all revolved around that fight at the end.
Clocks specifically, we see Jerry's watch, we see the clock in the classroom wall. Every single time we cut away from a scene, we see a clock in close up with Tangerine Dream giving us something percussive on the soundtrack, or ticking away in the guitar just to let you know every single second here is a second towards 3 o'clock.
Absolutely. All right. Well, my next film is the one that started it off. I actually have the vinyl of this, Sorcerer, Tangerine Dream, the great late William Friedkin. Wonderful film. I'm not going to go through the plot. I think everyone knows it's kind of a remake of The Wages of Fear. I had the joy of seeing the reissue of the film about 15 years ago, Davey, and William at the end was in Sydney and did a Q&A at the end of the movie, and that sort of lingers with me forever because he is a brilliant orator and a very witty sort of guy, and I think he had the canny ability to pick great musicians or pick artists that you would think, oh, that's left field, but it kind of works. Wang Chung with To Live and Die in LA is another example. This soundtrack, it was the 9th album for Tangerine Dream. I'll quickly share the story of how he came about with Tangerine Dream. So he was doing a tour of The Exorcist. He was doing the marketing tour, and he was in Germany, and he was in Frankfurt. And he said, well, what do you do in Frankfurt? What's playing tonight? And he was told that there was this band called Tangerine Dream, and they were playing in an abandoned church in the Black Forest at midnight. And he goes, okay, I'm game. There's nothing happening in Frankfurt. So he was driven out to the Black Forest, went to this church, and basically it was a concert where the three guys were all on stage. It was all electrified. You had guitar, a synth, drums. There were no stage lights. The only lights that were from the stage were the instrument lights, like power on. And it was 3 hours of Tangerine Dream doing their stuff. And he described it was very hallucinatory. It was very rhythmic. It sounds like a rave, Davey, doesn't it? Like 20 years ahead of a trance. But he was absolutely besotted because, it was very sensory. Just imagine he was sharing this. It was a packed church in the middle of the Black Forest, and you've got the three lads of Tangerine Dream playing their music. Anyway, he met with Edgar Froese at the end, and he tried to have a conversation because sort of in broken German said, look, I'm interested in you doing this movie that I want to do, Sorcerer. Anyway, they exchanged some messages. The result was he sent the script to Tangerine Dream. They wrote the music without seeing the movie. And it was, according to my research, it wasn't actually 4 hours. They came back with 7 hours. And William in interviews has threatened he was going to release that. I think when they did the reissue of Sorcerer, he was thinking of, maybe we can put it as a Blu-ray, but it never came out. So there's actually 7 hours of soundtrack. And he said it was just absolutely perfect. He received it, converted it into a cassette because he couldn't play the music when he was doing the film in South America. So he had to go to Mexico, convert it to a cassette tape. He played it back and he said it was perfect. This is just what I want. And he was kind of like a magpie, and he assembled the soundtrack out of these 7 hours to match the film, and voila, we've got Sorcerer. And this movie, it's just got, I don't think it's a very happy movie, because you've got these 4 characters that have got to do a job, and some of it's out of necessity, and they're in this South American country, and it's very oppressive. You've got heat, you've got sweat. They've got to drive a truck, or there's 2 trucks in this really, in this South American jungle that contains nitroglycerin, and it's kind of got that time element, the ticking bomb sort of element. And the soundtrack is really unrelenting. It's menacing, it's minimalist, it's very percussive. It's amazing. This went to number 23 or top 30 in the UK charts, and I think it even did okay in the American charts. It charted like a number 100 on the MCA label to boot. But anyway, the soundtrack is in perfect synergy with the movie. It's just very moogie. The synths, they're very analog, and it just really adds to the oppression and the tension of this movie. I find this a very uncomfortable film, but a very rewarding film. I don't think it's a film that I come out and go, oh, that was, feel exhilarated. I feel like I've just been, 10 rounds with Michael Tyson. It's just one of those movies. It's very tense. What do you think of Sorcerer?
I think the film and the album are both masterpieces. We did on say Tranquility and the Monsters Den a tribute to William Friedkin when he passed away last year, and we talked about The Exorcist, of course, being the Monsters Den. But at the end, I had to talk about Sorcerer for a couple of minutes, because to me, in its own way, it's as good, if not better, than The Exorcist. I mean,
I think it's better.
Apples and oranges, isn't it? So it's hard to say which is, but they're both perfect at what they're trying to do. This shows his love of Howard Hawks, I think, where Howard Hawks films would always have professionals who, men on a mission, who know exactly what they're doing. I don't want to be sexist, but masculine films. So Sorcerer's got that kind of feeling to it, where it's not woke or anything like that. I wouldn't fit into modern sensibilities. Not that it's anything anti-woke, but it's certainly a very old-fashioned type of film in that regards, where it's just about these men specifically and what they can do. And it takes a long time to set up, because the first, compared to Wedges of Fear especially, which is also a masterpiece, it takes a long time to get to the nitro and the bridge and whatnot, and the journey, because it takes such a long time setting up the characters, which is brilliant, because you care about them then. It's not just
exactly. Yes.
You really care about them by the time they get on that, and you're like, oh, please don't, especially Roy Scheider, who people obviously care about just because it's Roy Scheider, and at that point he was, just coming off of Jaws and whatnot. Again, this film flopped. It seems to be a bit of a current theme. And it is, in a way, it's baffling that it flops. But again, American cinema has gone from The Exorcist a few years earlier being the biggest film of the year. We're now in Star Wars territory, which completely changes the industry. Jaws has already kind of changed the industry, where it's all about the summer blockbusters and the teen crowds and being short and snappy and whatnot. Well, Jaws is certainly snappy. But this film is much more leisurely paced, intentionally so. It's much more sweaty. It feels more like a Sam Peckinpah film in places as well.
And it's very violent in some bits. The violence is really it's sudden, it's unexpected, and it really bites you in the butt, doesn't it?
And what Tangerine Dream bring to it is this menace and this kind of, I think it's more offbeat soundtrack. I mean, obviously it's the first, there's no precedent before this, but compared to Thief, which is very measured, because they've submitted all this music that's not specifically written for what they're seeing, it's a bit quirkier, it's a bit more offbeat. It sounds a bit like What's that show that everybody loves on Netflix that's trying to be the 80s all over again? Stranger
Stranger
Things.
Things. Yeah, Stranger Things.
Stranger Things feels very much like it's specifically trying to be Tangerine Dream of Sorcerer to me with its score. I don't know who does the score for Stranger Things, but that's even the theme tune. It sounds very much like the more ethereal stuff that we get here. We get a lot of very innovative synth work on this with the Betrayal, I think it's called, the Sorcerer theme. There's a few tracks on the album that are a bit too short, unfortunately, and I really love them and I wish they were longer. But that's what their albums are for, really. Where the album versions can be 7-8 minutes, but the film version is 2 minutes or something.
Absolutely. I think the master track on this is the Abyss. So when you're getting to the climax, I think Tangerine work on this album is just so effective. But it's definitely, it harks back to a lot of the old Tangerine material, doesn't it?
It's got the kind of stratosphere vibe to it.
Yeah, that sort of ambient, sort of progressive sound. But look, William, he's got a canny ear, and he heard something and he thought it was perfect. And he was actually saying, I wish I had them for The Exorcist. Imagine if they did The Exorcist.
Quite something when you think how iconic that section of Tubular Bells is, that William Friedkin says they would get rid of it for if he'd known Tangerine Dream earlier.
Yeah.
Which sounds sacrilegious, pardon the pun with The Exorcist, but it sounds sacrilegious. But I know exactly what he means, because their soundtrack work at its peak really is something which enhances every single film. I mean, it might not always be, as we've said, the most interesting listen as an album, but as music for a film, things like the Call on the Sorcerer soundtrack, it's got a kind of Pink Floyd, Crazy Diamond-like feel to it. That's one of the tracks that's a bit too short, probably because I'm comparing it to Crazy Diamond, which goes on forever. But they've got a real sense of bringing a lot more to certain parts of certain films that wouldn't be there if you just had, and I'm not putting them down at all, but say Jerry Goldsmith, or insert Alan Silvestri, a more conventional film composer, James Horner, that type. They wouldn't be able to come up with something as interesting. They might be able to come up with something iconic, say a John Williams, because that was his thing, memorable themes. But Tangerine Dream brings something that you might not go out whistling, because they're not making music like that. You're not supposed to whistle it in the way it's cinema, like the Superman theme or the Star Wars music. But you will, while you're watching the film, which is the most important thing, it'll engross you much more in the actual film itself than in a film score from one of those guys.
I think maybe the reason this film wasn't a success is because it's an art film and not a Hollywood commercial film. And a lot of the mavericks of the 70s got away with making art films because a lot of them were influenced by Fellini, Godard, etc., and they could get away with it through the prism of Hollywood. But maybe this pushed it a little too far. And Jaws coming out in 75 was a game breaker. And inevitably, anything after Jaws was a different world. And this film came out 1 week before Star Wars. So this was booked for a long run at the Chinese Theatre in Hollywood, which is the main motif cinema in Hollywood. And it got pulled because Star Wars was just doing gangbuster business. So timing was pretty awful. But maybe if this came out in 74, it may have done better business than 77. Maybe it was just at the wrong time.
Yeah, and it doesn't have a major film star in it. I mean, Roy Scheider was in Jaws, but you can't imagine, say, 13-year-olds becoming dedicated fans strictly of Roy Scheider because of Jaws and wanting to go see films just because he's in it. He's not that kind of film star.
I love him. I think he's a great actor. But
he's not Harrison Ford.
He's not box office. You know who he offered the role to? Steve McQueen. That's the greatest what if question. What do you think this movie would have been with Steve?
It might have been a bit too late in the game for Steve McQueen. He was although it might have been a late career renaissance, because he did have that good film where he died, where he was kind of mountain man. He had a big beard. Can't remember what that was called.
Enemy of the People.
That's it. Yeah, he looked completely different.
Yeah,
Steve McQueen at this point. Yeah, I can imagine it, because McQueen does lend himself to that kind of sweaty, masculine performance perfectly. But they probably were banking a bit on Roy Scheider, even though it wasn't a box office type actor.
He's got that everyman feel that you know how you're saying that there's so much invested in this story, in the backstory, that you care for the characters, even though you don't really care for them, because let's face it, they're all assholes. They're not very nice people. There's a lot of painful people in this movie, but you get a semblance of the background, and probably Roy Scheider is the best out of the bunch, and you are rooting for him, and he's got that everyman quality.
Yeah, a bit like Near Dark, where you're not supposed to sympathise, but you can still empathise with these characters. So you're not supposed to like them. You're not supposed to like Lance Henriksen. You're not supposed to like the guys in here, but you're supposed to at least believe them as people. Which, when the other cinema next door is showing Luke Skywalker and Obi-Wan Kenobi, realism's out the window all of a sudden, isn't it? So yeah, you're right. It probably was just a little bit. We're now coming towards the end of the real 70s Easy Riders, Raging Bull generation's power, which would be completely killed by Coppola with Apocalypse Now, and then obviously Heaven's Gate would be the big one that would really bring down Hollywood's kind of letting directors do whatever they wanted in the 70s. But yeah, Friedkin obviously had a lot of power after The Exorcist, and this just wasn't the project that was ever really going to become another blockbuster. And Warner's probably gave him too much leeway, which is great for us as film fans, but in terms of it ever having a chance to be a hit, I mean, how many films especially have ever gone to South America and then just bombed? It happens so often, because you just can't legislate for some of the stuff that happens down there with some rather insecure governments, to say the least, and then just weather disasters and film crews that aren't the most reliable. Filming in South America is almost a license to lose money.
Absolutely. Just ask Dennis Hopper in the last movie, and they put him in the wilderness for quite a considerable period of time.
That film's got a lot of problems apart from that, of course. But Alex Cox, who I recently had on my channel talking about his new movie, but when he was following up Sid and Nancy and Repo Man, he did the movie in South America, Walker, and he's working with Sandinistas and whatnot, so very unstable type arrangement. He's working with local gangsters and things, which, you don't get that at, filming in Pinewood and Elstree, so very different. But, to bring it full circle there with what we're saying about the film, what Tangerine Dream really lend to it is something completely different too, which you don't, it's so different to Wedge's Affair, even though the script itself is very similar in structure and obviously premise, but they're bringing a much more modernistic sensibility to it, which is, in terms of film scores, is so far ahead of the game. I mean, who was doing electronic film scores before this? Wendy Carlos, maybe, with A Clockwork Orange? Yes. Not many people were really doing it before that.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a masterly soundtrack, and looking at a lot of the Tangerine Dream websites and the fans, they put this right up at number one, if not in the top three or whatnot. They rate this very highly.
This is the exception to the rule where we said the most Tangerine Dream fans seem to be a little bit sniffy about their film scores because they prefer their album work. This is the exception that proves the rule, I think. Where It's a great album and it's a great film, and I think everyone kind of agrees that that's seen it or heard the album, and it works as an album as well, just like.
Absolutely. All right. Well, there we go. We've got our 2 picks each. Maybe we could throw some honorable mentions very briefly. Have you got a couple?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, Firestarter was one I was thinking about as well.
Yeah, bad movie, but pretty
Yeah,
solid soundtrack.
because I wanted to find something where the film might not be good, but the soundtrack's worth talking about. But then when I listen to it, it's kind of, as you said there, it's solid, but it's not anything particularly more than that. An interesting one is Legend, I think, because if you get and specifically, I think you need to get the American Blu-ray, so if people do pick up on this, make sure this is the edition I'm talking about. You get I think it is the American Blu-ray, you get 2 scores. You get the Tangerine Dream score, and you get Jerry Goldsmith's score, which is the one that was replaced and whatnot. So you get 2 scores. So just like I was saying a few minutes ago about having a more conventional film scorer, this is a brilliant example if you get that Blu-ray, because you can watch, if people don't know, it's Ridley Scott. It's a fantasy film with Tom Cruise. It's not a great film, but it's worth it for Tim Curry as the devil, if nothing else.
Oh, he chews up the scenery, doesn't he?
Yeah, he's and it's funny to see Tom Cruise doing crap like that, like just the boring romantic lead. But the Goldsmith score is bombastic and orchestral and gorgeous. And then when you watch it with the Tangerine Dream score, it's a completely different experience, where it's more mercurial and dark, and it feels more like a twisted fairy tale. And they bring their dramatic quality to it, obviously, and they know exactly what kind of film they're scoring. And it has the peaks and valleys, and it's not as manipulative as the Jerry Goldsmith score, which is a more traditional American type score, which is to manipulate the audience. John Williams being the ultimate example, but going back to Max Steiner with King Kong, the first full film score. Film scores traditionally were to manipulate the audience and tell them how to feel by making you feel it just through music. Goldsmith's still doing that here with Legend, but Tangerine Dream aren't doing that at all. They're doing something which is about the story, and it's telling you how the characters might be feeling at that moment. Just like we're copying James Caan's heartbeat when he's on the run in Thief, we're copying the romantic qualities of some characters, the sinister quality of Tim Curry's performance, and the sequences with him are much heavier and synth-driven. The sequences with Tom Cruise and I can't remember who the girl is in it, but they're much more melodic and much more ambient, much more Eno-like. So yeah, that's probably the best example if people want to see what difference it makes getting Tangerine Dream, is specifically get that Blu-ray, because you can literally see it on screen.
Yeah, I've got the DVD. I didn't progress it to Blu-ray, but I don't mind that film. I know it's not great, but it's so lush, not a cent is spared, and it's really Ridley Scott overdrive, if you know what I mean. And again, another film flop.
Yeah,
there's been a few of those. The one I want to showcase wasn't a film flop, and Tangerine Dream didn't provide the whole film score, but they did some scenes in the film, and that's Risky Business. So I think that's another one where people kind of remember Tangerine Dream. The train sequence, the romantic sequence between Rebecca De Mornay and Tom Cruise. Tangerine Dream, again, a sense of timing and that propulsive electronic 80s sound. I think that was quite influential, because I think there was so many movies after Risky Business that sort of copied that sort of soundtrack in teen comedies or whatnot.
Yeah, and interesting, we talk about 2 Tom Cruise films back to back there. And it's funny too that it's they've got an interesting score for that, although I suppose it's more of a, as you say, an interstitial score rather than the full score. But interesting, they're completely overshadowed by one piece of music in particular, which is just Bob Seger's old-time rock and roll because of that iconic scene of Tom Cruise in his underpants. Yeah, that's an interesting one where people can, again, contrast a couple of composers with Tangerine Dream and popular music at the same time. So it's almost like the different divergent path that we're talking about, where some films, most films, let's be honest, in that kind of teen area would just use songs from MTV because it's nice and easy and kids will flock to see it. Whereas if you get Tangerine Dream in, you might get something a bit more interesting. It may not get you in the charts. It won't guarantee you any kind of MTV play at all. But you might get something more interesting for your film.
Absolutely.
Something quite different for these filmmakers who I think, like Catherine Bigelow, she's more interested in what helps the film rather than a John Hughes who's more interested in what sells the film. She's more interested in what helps the film, regardless of box office. Which,
absolutely.
That's better for us as film fans, but
yeah. Well, Davey, this has been a lot of fun talking about some movies that we love. Some of these movies are just some of my all-time favorites. So I think it's a good excuse to have a yak about movies and soundtrack, movies and sound.
And throwing in the movie stuff lets us not just be too wanky about music for an hour, So
absolutely, it's a good excuse to segue movies in as well. So
you can jump back and forth.
Please like and subscribe to Rock Daydream Nation, folks. Tell us what's your favorite Tangerine Dream soundtrack. What's your favorite movie that they've scored? We love reading your comments, but anything about Tangerine Dream, maybe put a shout out for some of the Tangerine Dream non-soundtrack albums, because some great material. And Tangerine Dream is still going to this day. So they've been around since, I think, Davey, 1969 or 1970, but they're still going strong.
Started out as a kind of Beatles type, very different. And when I really get into music, they were the bane of my existence because we had a krautrock section in the record store that I worked in, and all we seemed to have was Tangerine Dream and Klaus Schulze, but there seemed to be 250 albums for each. And so prolific, trying to catalogue them and which one did we sell there, which one do I need to reorder to the nightmare.
Yeah.
Plenty for people to check out for Tangerine Dream.
Absolutely. Anyway, great to have you on, Davey. Rock Daydream Nation, tell us what you think, and me and Davey will offline, we'll come up with another show idea, and we'll see you soon on the channel, 2024, 2025. See you later. Cheers.
Cheers.